This story is about a girl with a life of luxury. Asia grew up in a huge mansion, dressed in beautiful gowns, and wore shiny jewelry, but it didn't give her any pleasure. She always wanted something different, and one day, she wanted to go on a trip, to see the world beyond the empire. She had a feeling that this was the only thing that could make her enjoy life. Every time you get to a new place, Asia realized that traveling was exactly what she was ready to do for the rest of her life, and so began her new life as a traveler. The girl's been everywhere and concluded that she liked this life much better than sitting in a palace receiving endless gifts. Before she knew it, she'd been to every corner of the northern continent. And after that, Asia headed straight for the south side. She began her journey across the desert and resolved to reach the southern country. But then, something happened that the girl wasn't prepared for. It's been a whole week since she got lost in this vast desert, but that's not the worst of it. She's completely out of drinking water. So it's become impossible to be in this hot desert. Thirsty, she suddenly notices some people. Not to miss an opportunity, Asia began to scream very loudly, hoping they could help her. She asked them to stop and they agreed to listen to her. She thanked them and tried to explain her problem. But for some reason, she found it very difficult to formulate a sentence. The only thing she wanted was to know the right road. But, for a moment, the girl never had time to say anything before one of them drew his sword. A guy hears her say the name of a country, and the second he hears it, he sees her as an enemy. He let her say the last words, but he never explained what he didn't like. At the very last moment, Asia asked him to hide the sword, and told him he couldn't do that to her. The guy was very surprised and wanted to know where she got that from, in which case she has only one option left to survive: to come up with something that will interest this guy and make him change his mind. Asia told him she was the most beautiful woman on the entire continent. The girl decided to charm him with her looks, and pretend that she is not ordinary, but special. After that, her acting continued. She said she thought every country should have a law about the need to protect beautiful ladies, because it's only natural to protect what one likes. It was very brave and unexpected for each of them. In response, their chief smiled and even said she was very funny, but apparently it was all pointless. He drew his sword again and asked to say his last words. Seems to be getting as desperate as possible. All she has to do is try to survive and at least dodge the sword. Asia was very frightened and regretted approaching these people. She said he can't just swing his sword around without warning. Because it's against the rules! The guy marveled at her stress tolerance again, but that didn't affect his decision in any way. He warned that as a result, some of them would still die and only one would be left alive. But I'm sure there's nothing more to say. How human eyes could be so intense. They reminded her of two suns in the height of summer. Even at such a dangerous moment, Asia couldn't help but notice his good looks. He could destroy her at any moment. And it's strange that right now, the girl is thinking not of safety, but of his beauty. When he suddenly started coming closer and closer. Would he try to hurt her again? The guy touched her, and his gaze is not the same as it was in the beginning. And it seems the girl's plan has worked out well. I'm very interested in what this means and how this conversation will end. When all of a sudden, Asia heard him say something she never thought she would. The guy complimented her and started admiring her beauty, and then afterward, admitted that he was actually planning to destroy it. But now, he's finally changed his mind, and thinks that now she should be grateful to him for it. It was an amazing encounter, and luckily everyone survived. Sometime later, Asia woke up in an unknown location due to the terrible heat. She barely opened her eyes and she was very thirsty. At that moment, she wasn't thinking about anything else, when suddenly, a stranger came up to her. He poured cool water from a bucket on her, and said that the girl should be grateful for it, and that he would see how long she could live under the scorching sun. It becomes clear that everyone around her is going to treat her the same way as this stranger. He was certainly a great help, but Asia had expected a more pleasant conversation. Anyway, that's not the point. She needs to understand why and where she is now. It turns out that this prison is located in the center of the city, and maybe it was built here on purpose so that the inmates would be constantly tormented by the heat. Looking at the way the people outside were dressed, she realized that it could only be one place: the Desert King. Her home country is on the northern continent, and the King of the Desert, in the south, is a huge state that occupies the largest area of the south. Most importantly, this country is the biggest enemy of the country it was born in. Now that she's here, the worst thing she can do is regret something and do nothing. This place is built to abuse delinquent people. The girl is not used to this climate, so she may not survive in such conditions. Which means she only has one option left, to come up with some kind of plan and get out of here as fast as possible, like most of the people in this building are trying to do. Control and security around the building is very well thought out and reinforced. Meanwhile, Asya happened to notice a familiar face. She looked at him closely, and it seemed to be the same man she had recently met in the desert. Which means she doesn't want his attention and would rather not be noticed. After a while, Asya used a hairpin and tried to open the lock. The girl had inherited her beauty and her silvery moonlight hair from her mother. She always wanted her daughter to grow up to be an elegant lady. Every time Asya ran away from home, her mother was very angry and locked her up in a rage. But the girl was not the sort of child who would obediently sit and think about her behavior. She always found ways to do things her own way and learned how to open any lock. And now, a skill she could really use. Asya mentally thanked her mom, because it was only because of that woman that the girl became a master of escape, because she was always locked up and looking for ways to escape. Learned many things that helped her when traveling. She managed to stay in shape during her imprisonments. The lady was learning about 100 ways to escape, and as it turned out, it wasn't all for nothing. Even in such a desperate situation, Asya had no problem escaping from the most guarded building of all. She doesn't think prison is the right place for a pretty girl like her. First, you need to look for clothes like the locals, so you don't attract unwanted attention. Women here have to hide their faces to avoid seducing other men. Asya isn't thrilled with this tradition, but either way, such clothing would do her good right now. She's managed to find the right look and become like the locals. The girl read about this state. It told of a beautiful and strong nation built on sands, which is why she always wanted to visit this country at least for one day. There is scalding air everywhere, buildings made of sand, and the people are very much of different nations. Once here, Asya was convinced that this place was indeed even more beautiful than described in the books. It's like she's on another planet. Even with these conditions, her new life brings her much more happiness than a luxurious mansion and dull days of. She was so pleased with her decision to run away that she couldn't help but scream loudly in the street. A lot of people looked at her. Asya realized her mistake and decided it was better not to do that. If someone recognizes her and tells that guy about her escape, she'll never get a second chance at freedom again. After a while, she reflected that before it was too late, it wouldn't hurt to find a place to sleep. And more importantly, to get food so you don't starve to death in the middle of the street in a few days. She hasn't eaten in days, and if she doesn't eat something soon, there could be a problem. Surprisingly, the girl found some store that sells prepared food. She got herself some meat and vegetables. Asya was looking forward to savoring the first bite when suddenly she saw that man again. And at that moment, the most humiliating thing happened. She accidentally dropped her food and all the meat ended up on the floor. She just couldn't believe her eyes. That guy's getting too close, and it's possible that of all these people, he's looking for her. The girl froze in one place, and by doing so, she made it worse. He noticed her, and immediately saw the frightened look in her eyes. Asya had made a huge mistake. It would have been much better if she had just turned away and not looked at him. We can only hope he just walks by and the girl gets very lucky. The first thing she decided to do was to calm down and start hoping that no one would recognize her covered face. Just a second later, she hadn't even taken a step before she heard someone coming toward her. It's as stressful as possible. Asya has no idea how or what to do. She turned around and looked at him and tried to smile. It seems after this, she's going to lose her freedom very soon and forever. It just depends on whether this guy recognizes her and how he reacts to her trying to run away. Very interesting what he's suited for, because maybe it's not as bad as it seems. He could just be passing through, but for now, Asya is sure she's been declassified. At that moment, she thought it would be a good idea to run away, but realized there was no point. Someone would catch her anyway. Especially if she does try to run away. In case she does get caught, no one will trust her anymore. And finally, the guy talked to her. He said he really resented her behavior and didn't think she'd turn out to be so unsettled. And after that, the best part was when he asked her to tell him how she did it. The girl didn't hide anything and started to tell me how she did it. But at that moment, the guy wouldn't let her do it. He called one of his assistants and decided he couldn't go on like this. He wanted to beef up security and make sure the girl didn't run away from him. And in the meantime, he's ordered me to keep an eye on her until he gets back. The guy made it clear that if they didn't do what he asked or something went wrong, he'd just fire them. Then he looked at Asya and asked her not to disappoint him again, or else he would regret it so much. Meanwhile, the girl was being led off in some unknown direction, and she was getting nervous. Because she doesn't know what they're planning to do with her. The worst that can happen is someone will try to punish her for running away. Asya tried to call out for help, but no one was interested. She was simply ignored. And meanwhile, the guy started consulting with the assistant and thinking about the best way to handle the situation. Back in the desert, he never imagined that this stranger would turn out to be really special. During the conversation, the aide asked why the gentleman would not use her to his advantage. The boy thought about these words and asked the assistant to explain how Asya could help him. He explained that although the girl was acting aggressively, her manner of speech and appearance were unusual, as was her aura. He thought she might be the daughter of some nobleman from the northern continent. He even developed a strong intuition and a desire to see if it was true. The gist of his suggestion is that the gentleman can ask her to pass on information of interest to them. The benefit is that with Asya's help, they can learn the plans and strategies of the enemy empire. After that, the guy said he had a little plan and an idea of what to do. The aide asked for more details about it, and eagerly began to wait for what he had to say. And at last the gentleman made his final decision and decided that he would consider the girl as his future wife. Evening came on. Some girl came up to Asya and asked her to follow her. I'm very curious to see what happens next, and how she reacts to the decision of Mr. Unaware, she follows this girl and tries to see everything around her. It's incredibly beautiful everywhere, especially in the morning and late afternoon. They came and stopped at some entrance. This girl knocked, and in response, they were given permission to enter. Asya doesn't understand anything but tries not to show it. She saw several unfamiliar girls and wondered who they were. It took literally seconds for one of them to walk up, and without warning, started grabbing Asya by the collar. The girl asked me not to touch her and to explain what's going on here. Strangers began to take things from her, and with each passing second, Asya began to fear them more and more. They ended up taking all her stuff and started taking her to the pool. It's very strange that none of them said a single word. The girls seem to be following someone's orders, and it seems that it's not the first time that this is happening here. It seems like some kind of tradition or something to conspire against a rival. After that, things got calmer, and it turns out they didn't mean any harm. They just have this custom of welcoming newcomers. Unfortunately, they always do it without warning and don't explain why you had to be prepared. Meanwhile, each of them doing her own thing first. Some of them scattering rose petals, and some of them grooming Asya's hair. It's very much a team effort. But so far, the girl doesn't understand what they're doing it for. She expected some cruel punishment, and didn't think she'd end up in such a beautiful place right after she escaped. After all the treatments, she was finally spoken to and given a dry, clean towel. And then, one of them brought new clothes and asked her to put them on. The thing is, these clothes are very different from what Asya is used to wearing. But even now, she has no idea what to expect next, or who's waiting for her in the next room. Is the same gentleman who recently made plans for her. It's very strange that she was forced to clean herself up before going into his room. Asya realizes that it was probably done for a reason. While waiting for an appointment, before this, the gentleman spoke to the assistant, who noticed his good mood and asked him what it was about. The guy replied that he was in a really good mood and very happy. He's probably just waiting for Asya to walk in on him. The girl was very carefully prepared for this meeting, and now it's clear why it was done. She wore these things only because she thought that if she didn't do it herself, in any case, these people would get their way, and force her to do so. For a moment, Asya remembered her things, and wondered where they might be now. The last time she saw them was before the dive in the pool. After that, it all went away. Anyway, she'll have to find her bag, because there's a map, money, and clothes inside. And even portraits of good-looking guys. It's all there. More importantly, the bag contains her book, the only item that can confirm her identity while traveling. If the book gets lost somewhere, or worse, they don't give it back, it's a big problem. Anyway, Asya still has the most important thing on her, special magic earrings, which is colored by her real eyes and silver-colored hair. In brown, it turns out, thanks to the jewelry. All this time, she could travel without fear of being recognized. Meanwhile, one of those girls spoke to her and again asked her to follow her. After that, they went down some corridor, and it seems like the fun part starts. With each step, Asya became more and more unaware of what was happening and what she was being so carefully prepared for. She gets an uneasy feeling, even a little apprehension. Once there, the girl saw an incredible sight. And the room she was given for a while, the girl began to look at her new apartment. not even realizing why she had been assigned such a luxurious room all of a sudden. If she only knew what the gentleman had in mind for her. But I guess all in good time. Asya thanked the girl and said that she hadn't even counted on such wonderful conditions. Very interesting how this story will end. Because with each passing day, it's impossible to predict what will happen next. After a little thinking, the girl suggested one option. But after that, immediately tried not to think about it. She would hate to be locked up and unable to get out of this empire. Unfortunately, that's what it looks like for now. The girl got a style change, a new room, and a tour of the mansion. She's slowly being accustomed to the rules and doing her best to make Asya excited about being here. Do they want the girl to ignore and accept that she'll be here forever? There's no telling how they'll behave if she says or tries to leave. From that moment, Asya began to think of only one thing: what she would do if it turned out that way. Because of the panic, she can't stay calm and react normally during a conversation. She realized the most important thing was that you can't tell anyone about your plans and suspicions. It's much better to pretend like she's fine with it, but at the same time, try to work something out. And she knows she's not going to stay here much longer. She didn't start traveling to find herself locked up and without the freedom she used to have. Asya left home to make her life interesting and do what she wants to do. Be where you want to be, talk to who you want to talk to, and say what you want to say. Being here, the girl does not feel any freedom and is not sure of her safety. In the meantime, a guest had arrived at the gentleman's house, and the assistants asked permission to show the guest to his room, and only after that they took him to the master. As it turns out, this man is a very powerful man, and they've known each other before. As the man arrived unannounced, he apologized for that, and thanked her for allowing him in. The reason for his visit must be very serious. Turns out he's interested to know how the guy decided to consider Asya as his future wife. In this man's opinion, she's not worthy of it, and it would be far more appropriate to choose another girl for the role. The guy listened to his opinion, and right after that, his mood took a noticeable turn for the worse. He's starting to resent it, which means conflict is inevitable. He looked at him with an aggressive look and made it clear that his companion had better not start a conversation on the subject. And afterward, the guy asked how dare he question his decision and choice of bride. The man realized he'd made a mistake, but unfortunately, it was too late to apologize. Usually when someone doesn't like a decision or action of the emperor, those people are either killed or very severely punished, and live in agony for the rest of their lives. This time, the man just got lucky. The guy just told him to go away. He's in a good mood that he didn't want to ruin. Anyway, he made it clear that if anyone tried to get in his way again, they would regret it very much. Meanwhile, night has fallen, and the girl is still in her room thinking about the future. She's scared to stay here forever and thinks that maybe the idea of traveling was a mistake. Even if her life is safe, staying here is not what she dreamed of when she left home. All Asya wanted to do was see the desert and visit some of the cities, but she didn't even think about it. To be locked up in an empire that is her country's enemy. The girl doesn't plan to sit around and wait for the moment when she regrets not getting out of here in time. So far, she's motivated and willing to do something. She was able to escape from the most secure location without any problems, so escaping from the mansion would be a breeze. This would all be a lot easier if it weren't for one thing. First problem, Asya has lost all of her belongings and has no idea where to find them, or if they will be given back at all. Even if she tries to escape without her stuff, she won't last long. Especially without a counting book. It's a book she made as a symbol of her parents' authority to record important routes while traveling. Without it, she won't be able to move freely on the continent. The second problem, her special earring. The spell that's on them doesn't last forever, so she'll have to take them off for a week or they'll just break. According to the calculations, the earrings will last exactly 1 week, which means she has to leave this place within a week. First, we need to survey the area and find out the exact location of the... It's time to take action. Since the girl has no responsibilities, she has a great opportunity to use her free time properly. Besides, there's nothing stopping her from taking action right now. Luckily, she's not banned from going outside and walking around the palace grounds. She became very curious as to why this area was so vast. All the buildings here are arranged in such a way that it becomes very difficult for someone like Asya to find a way out. But that's not the only problem. She's really curious about the guy who got her here. Judging by his appearance, we can assume that he is clearly one of the main. It turns out the girl decided not to wait for the next day and acted now. She managed to jump over the fence while the guards were scrutinizing the area. But that's not all. She's got a lot more fences to jump. On the way, Asya began to look around the area, and it seemed she wasn't going to hurry up, when suddenly, approaching the garden, she saw the silhouette of a familiar man by the swimming pool. At this point, Asya tried to hide behind the bushes so no one would see her. She tried to do it as quietly as possible, because if that man saw her, it would be very bad. The girl wondered who and why anyone would want to come to the garden at this late hour. Looking a little closer, she recognized the man and couldn't believe her eyes. If this is the same guy who recently decided to make her his fiancée, I wonder if he'll notice her presence and how he'll react. Realizing that it was best not to linger here, Asya decided that she should at least try to leave unnoticed. She started to crawl away, but I think it's too late. She didn't make it unnoticed. It was as if the guy had teleported and was near her at the exact moment the girl decided to leave. When suddenly, she was so startled by his voice that she did not notice how she happened to be near the water. Asya began to make excuses and convince him that things were not as they might have looked from the outside. She hadn't planned to spy on him, and didn't think she'd meet him in the garden this late in the day. And afterwards, she started to resent how horrible he'd been to her. But the guy responded by reminding her that, in this country, he could do whatever he wanted. To which the girl asked to be told at last who he was, for she had still never learned anything about him. Finally, the moment had come when Asya recognized that this guy was a king and really had the right to do whatever he wanted to do. So it's no wonder he didn't ask her opinion before deciding to make her his wife. After a while, he even told her his name. The guy's name is Michael. I can see why he doesn't care about a girl's consent to a relationship. At some point, Asya realized that it would take a more solid and well-thought-out plan to get away from this man. It wasn't as easy as she'd imagined in the beginning. Even when things are going well, he keeps showing up out of nowhere and ruining everything. When suddenly, the most interesting thing began. Asya did not expect that at this moment he'll take her in his arms, and without explanation, he'll start walking somewhere. She asked him to stop, but unfortunately he just ignored it. The girl became even more nervous because there was no telling what to expect from this man after a few minutes. They found themselves in a room, which made her even more nervous. Michael said that from day one he began to suspect her of being a spy, and he was sure he wasn't wrong. The girl realized that it was better not to tell the truth, so she replied that she came from the northern continent, but had nothing to do with his enemies. She said she wasn't a spy, and in fact, she was just traveling and happened to get lost in the area. And afterward, the girl hinted that she had no plans to stay here and would like to resume her journey. Asya was beginning to hope that she would be understood and finally set free. But judging by Mike's reaction, it's impossible to know what he thinks about it or what he's going to do next. When suddenly, he asked her a very strange question. Which is to say, has Asya been trying to get him to like her since they first met in the desert? She felt as awkward as possible, and only after a while did she realize why he had asked that particular question. For it is now that she stands before him in such a way that, if it were him, he could not think of just that. Asya noticed his strange look and asked why he was looking at her so intently. At this point, he had a great change of demeanor and recalled her words that she was the most beautiful woman on the continent. I don't know if there's any way he wants to be sure, but it's unclear how. The girl replied that those were indeed her words, and afterward asked her to step away from her. She was uncomfortable talking, but Michael didn't seem to think anything of it. He moved even closer to her, touched her face, and started looking into her eyes. The king even admitted that when he looks at her, he gets a strange feeling he's never had before. Michael was no longer in control. He started saying and doing what he was feeling. But whether he's really sincere at that moment, the girl doubts very much. She's sure that if he really liked her, he'd treat her completely differently. Asya is sure what he's doing now is an attempt to change her mind and make her stay after all. If Michael had any feelings, he would have at least asked her opinion, and in this situation, he would have asked for her consent. But nothing of the kind happened, and accordingly the girl felt very unpleasant and wanted to go away and never see him again. He's being respectful and not thinking what Asya's thinking at that moment. The girl started to resist and made it clear she wanted to get out of here. I just hope the guy realizes that and doesn't do things his own way without taking her opinion into account. The girl realizes that almost nothing depends on her now, but at the same time, she still has hope that Michael is not as cruel as he seems at first glance. But unfortunately, every time he proves otherwise and shows a disrespectful attitude. Surprisingly, she was very lucky. The king did not insist and let her rest after all. The next day came, and today, the girl woke up much earlier than usual. She was having a very bad night's sleep and kept having flashbacks from a time when she didn't have any problems. Asia opened her eyes and saw a strange girl in her room. She asked who she was and what she was doing here, to which the girl replied that Asia need not worry, for she was just her new assistant. And from this day forward, she would be around all the time. The assistant said that if the mistress needed her help, she would do anything. Asia got excited and said it was a pleasure to meet her. But at the same time, it was immediately clear to her what this was for. Most likely after last night's situation and her escape, Michael decided to step up surveillance and made it so that Asia would be watched by an assistant who would always be by her side, and in case she tried to run away, she would tell him about it right away. After that, Olivia asked if there was anything she could ask of her mistress. It turns out Olivia wants to ask that Asia stop being so polite to her, since she's her assistant, not her friend. The girl was of course surprised and realized that the assistant was not used to being treated well by her. So the girl has one more problem, one more person to stop her from escaping. A helper is never superfluous, but in some situations, you'll need to figure out how to stay private. The most important thing is to tell her correctly that Asia wants to be left alone. This is to ensure that the assistant doesn't get suspicious, because if she thought the girl was cheating on her and was up to something despite the order, Olivia might get suspicious and start following her around. And there's no way that's going to happen. Despite making it harder to escape, Asia is not going to give up. She realizes she doesn't plan to stay here under any circumstances. It's not her home. The girl still can't believe she's in a neighboring empire that she has to escape from. Not long ago, she could not imagine that then, in the wilderness, it would have been better to suffer without water than to turn to him for help. She's not being bullied here, and at first glance, it's a dream life. But the thing is, it's not what Asia dreamed of. She left home and started traveling for freedom and something new. New things happened, but she never got her freedom. It turns out that the girl only made things worse. She doesn't understand how someone can have the right to dispose of another person's freedom. A few days ago, she was walking in the desert and couldn't have imagined that her life would undergo such a change. It's just outrageous. But at the same time, Asia wanted something new and different, and she got it. Now I have to figure out how to get out from under Michael's control. There's something else she's always thinking about. Her first kiss. Michael, that's not the guy she pictured it with. And for that, she hates him now. He did what he wanted and didn't ask if she wanted him to. Meanwhile, the king, as usual, listens to the new information his aide has learned for him. That man who is outraged about Asia is up to something, so the deputy asks what they're going to do about it. Michael replied that it wasn't as bad as it looked, and it would be better just to watch him. It turns out they're not alone in this room. There's someone else with them. This fellow. He somehow signaled to the Lord's aide to inquire about the woman with whom the king had recently returned to the palace. Right after that, the deputy asked him the same question he got from that guy. Then he began to say the same thing that the king had been told by the man, which means the king's reaction will be exactly the same as the last time. Wonder how the assistant dared to tell him, for he himself remembered how the conversation on the subject had ended last time, but with another man. After realizing his mistake, the guy immediately apologized and said he shouldn't have said that and misspoke a little bit. After that guy joined the conversation. He added that Asia's choice wasn't quite right, because someone would be unhappy with that decision, and to avoid upsetting a powerful man who wouldn't like it. According to the aides, the king had better think about his choices. Right after that, Michael got angry and decided to get a better look at what Asia was like. He ordered her to the room immediately, which means something interesting is about to happen. A few minutes later, Olivia came to her mistress and told her the unexpected news. Olivia said that Asia had better finish her breakfast, for the king wanted to see her in his room immediately. And he's not interested in whether the girl is busy or in the mood to talk. She hasn't had a full breakfast lately and she's sick of it. Also, she resented his behavior. The girl had never before had to feel in the shoes of ordinary people, because before, she was the one who ordered me into her office. Meanwhile, they came to him and began to expect some word from him. Instead, the guy stared at her in silence and thought about something for a few minutes. Afterward, Olivia apologized and said she had to leave them alone, because that's the way it's done. Asia didn't expect this and was very scared. She asked her to stay, because there was no telling what Michael was up to this time. But unfortunately, the assistant couldn't break the rules, because she's not supposed to stay and hear their conversation. Eventually, The girl began to look down at the floor and tried to avoid eye contact as she suddenly... Michael asked how much longer she planned to avoid his gaze, to which the girl replied that she wasn't avoiding it. She was just uncomfortable being in that room. The guy asked how she slept, and, surprisingly, very oddly, the girl said it was fine thanks to him. In response, the king hinted that since the girl liked it here so much, she could stay here forever. Asya chuckled and pretended to be pleased to hear the suggestion, but at the same time it made her as uncomfortable as possible to even think about it. She would not want to stay with this man more than anything else. So hearing him say such things was not something she would want to. At this point, he began to touch her hands and watch her reaction closely. His gaze became that of a guy in love, looking forward to her reciprocation. But at the same time, the king doesn't forget about the previous conversation with his aides and tries to figure out if he's doing everything right. The king remembered the words of one of them, that perhaps the girl could be the daughter of some nobleman from the northern continent. So he started asking her various questions, namely, what brought her to the empire, to which the girl replied that she had already answered that question and said that she was just a regular traveler who wanted to see the sights. And as soon as the girl said the word, the king warned that if she heard it one more time, she would regret it very much. Very interesting what made him so angry and why the word landmark elicited such a reaction from him. Every time he looks at her like that, it makes her experience something she's never experienced before. But one thing remains clear. Her gut tells her to stay as far away from this guy as possible. To remedy the situation, Asya changed the subject and started talking about the dates this empire is famous for. The girl explained that one of the reasons she went on the trip was the dates and the local buildings. At that moment, she thought it sounded too lame, and at any moment, she could make Michael even angrier. He ended up saying it was funny, and was surprised that she crossed the desert of doom for these odd reasons. In all this time, except for her, not one person has dared to do it because everyone knows how dangerous it is. It turns out Asya had never heard of it before. Now I can see why she'd met almost no one there. Each had already said what they wanted to say, and at that moment, they began to look toward the aide. Asya looked at him, and immediately realized that she had seen him somewhere before. He has a memorable enough appearance that it's impossible to forget. He's the only person with an unusual hair color, and therefore very easy to remember. At this point, they fell into an awkward silence. Neither knew what to talk about or how to act. The aide thought he was superfluous here, and asked if it would be better if he left them alone. But the king asked him to stay and suggested they get acquainted. When it was the girl's turn, Michael suddenly stopped talking, and wondered how properly she could be introduced and who she was. The lad had not expected such a situation to occur, for before, he had never thought of what Asya was to him. After a while, it turns out that's not the only problem, and in fact the guy couldn't remember her name the whole time. In fact, it was no surprise. Asya had never told them her name before, but now was the perfect time to do so. After that, they got to know each other, and surprisingly, the aide started giving her a lot of compliments. The girl was of course very pleased, but the king obviously didn't like it. He even asked the assistant to escort the girl back to her room. None of them understood what had happened or why Michael's mood had faded so quickly. Before leaving his room, the assistant turned round and looked at his masters, and after that, he was even more confused about the situation. He wanted to hurry back and find out what was wrong. After a while, the aide returned and decided to listen to the king. Michael doesn't understand why the girl is giving him such a hard time about it. She didn't want to talk to him or answer questions, but now you can't tell she's shy or doesn't like talking to people. He decided to try to get information from her and asked an assistant to find out who she was. After a while, the staff prepared one of the rooms for a very important conversation. Asya was invited into this room and offered a seat. This time, she was told to hide her face from the other men. Eventually, she began to be asked many questions, thus fulfilling the king's orders. And the very first question sounded like this: where she came from and where her home is. Asya said that it was a very small state that was on the northern border of the neighboring empire. At this point, the girl tries to answer his questions, but at the same time, tries not to tell anything unnecessary. And at one point, in the middle of the conversation, she asked if she could ask a follow-up question. The guy said that, of course, he would answer any question. Asya asked about the place she was caught in a few days ago. She wondered why it was called the Desert of Doom. It turns out that it is because this desert does not accumulate water even when it rains, and as a result of strong winds, The topography changes a lot, so it is very easy to get lost in it. Considering all these factors, a person in that desert wouldn't last a few days. The guy even gave some examples of travelers who stayed there. But the interesting thing is that there are rumors about this place, such as that the desert has been cursed for years. Eventually, to make sure that the girl was not deceiving him or trying to hide her real identity, he decided to test her and asked her if she knew that the empire where she came from had long been in conflict with the empire where she was now. To which the girl replied that it was the first time she had heard of this. She said she only knew that her empire had been erected by people who were against the founding of Michael's empire, but she did not know that the two were enemies. Recently there was a conflict between these two empires, which is why their relationship is quite strained. Asya continued to pretend she knew nothing about it, and said she now understood why she was perceived as the enemy on the first day. Surprisingly, among all possible options, the girl managed to ask the king a question about how to get to a state hostile to his country. It's not surprising that after escaping from prison, she continued to appear suspicious in people's eyes. The girl made a lot of mistakes, but so far, nothing too terrible has happened, luckily. After a while, the guy asked if he could ask her one more question. In response, Asya agreed and said she would try to give as detailed an answer as possible. He's very curious to know if she was warned about the dangers of traveling through the desert. Asya responded that there was a lot of talk about it, but in the end she didn't listen to anyone and decided it was no big deal. As a result, it is not known how, but the fellow can say with certainty that about the way through the desert she is definitely lying. He has no intention of stopping and is determined to find out what she may be hiding from them. To look more convincing, Asya began to talk about how on the northern continent there are very beautiful, colorful mountains, fields, and the weather is beautiful all year round there. But there's only one thing missing: the desert that everyone in the empire where she was born dreams of seeing. Accordingly, she explained that that's why she wanted to go to that desert so badly. The questions didn't end there. The guy continued the conversation and decided to ask her one more thing. He wondered how she felt after being in the desert, to which the girl replied that the place was even more exciting than she had imagined. To her it was so inexpressibly beautiful that she did not even think of the sun, which was mercilessly burning the sand. Asya had of course embellished her emotions a bit, but she only did so to make herself look less suspicious, as suddenly, the guy concluded that the girl had told him the truth. He thanked her for her answers and told her that she was the only person who called the Desert of Doom an awesome place. It turns out that the girl managed and did everything right. The assistant believed her words, which means that she started to trust her a lot more. But it didn't end there. The guy asked her to stay and said he had something interesting for her. At which point, he pulled out her bag and started watching her reaction. And after that, said they looked through her belongings and decided to return the ones they didn't find suspicious. But they'll have to take something from her. I wonder what they found most suspicious in her bag. If all of a sudden they decide to take the book away from her, that would be too bad. The girl hopes they choose something else. The guy never said what they were taking from her. Apparently we'll find out a little later. After a while, he thanked her for talking to him and said he had no further questions, so the girl can be free to go back to her room. Meanwhile, the aide came to the aide, the same fellow who had suggested what the king should have said some time ago. The aide hadn't expected it to come to him at this very moment, but he'd have to listen to it anyway. He's probably here on some important business or has something interesting to tell you. After a while, the guy listened to him and decided to ask him for something, to follow the mansion for a while. But he didn't really like this request. He wasn't used to taking orders from someone else. He was in charge of security, and usually ordered his charges to keep an eye on the mansion. Anyway, he'll have to do it because it was the king's own order, and they can't ignore it. No one cares whether they like this order or not. The people who are responsible for the protection of the territory will be obliged to work in a reinforced mode. They realize it themselves, and it's no wonder that some people wouldn't want to work without a day off. It's absolutely fine, but unfortunately, according to the aide, they have no other option. After that, the conversation about the girl started. The deputy said he still had suspicions. He still doesn't understand how she ended up here, and some of her things are questionable. Especially he can't understand why the girl decided to travel alone and went to the desert of death without any training and refused to listen to her parents about it being too dangerous. Even though Asya doesn't seem like someone who might have bad intentions, No one can be sure she's what she seems at first glance. Since the two of them are responsible for the safety of the Empire, it's their duty to do everything they can to prevent something bad from happening. Meanwhile, Asya has already returned to her room and is enjoying the peace of mind she constantly lacks. At first sight, the king's aide seems a good man for her, if he really believes that she is only a traveler. Given her previous behavior, it's not strange that he might think she's a spy. After her several attempts to escape for unknown reasons, it's no wonder she's not soon to be trusted. After this, there's no reason for the king to believe her words and not look for some hidden meaning in them. The thing is, if her identity is revealed, her family could be in grave danger, as could the entire empire she comes from. Of course, her parents won't let the country fall apart over some conflict. But still, before it's too late, she owes it to herself to do something to keep her parents safe. Her father has always supported Asya's interest in traveling, and her mother has always loved her despite her strict nature. At that moment, someone suddenly knocked on the door and asked to come in, but before doing so, the girl asked what was wrong. This man said that by the king's decision, a man would be appointed to watch over her safety. The girl hadn't expected to hear such news, but realized that it was also done for a reason. It must make some sense. And it's most likely only done to reduce the chance of her escaping, except how serious it is only depends on how badly the king wants to keep her here forever. Not matched by the guy who is against her being in this empire at all, which means it's pointless to hope for a good attitude on his part. He looked at her with a cold stare and let her know that no good would come of this. Asya is no longer surprised that every day, escaping from here is getting harder and harder to do. The most frustrating thing is realizing that no one around her will be able to help her in a situation where she needs it. Even though some people are okay with her now, it doesn't mean they'll help her in some situation. Either way, the girl realizes that right now it's best not to confront him and try to keep things civil. Asya started to smile and tried her best not to make him angry or ruin his impression of herself, because it's their first meeting, and if somehow she screws it up, it's hard to fix. In fact, the guy had pictured her quite differently. He was sure that a girl who had managed to escape from prison, and who had gotten there in the first place, had to look something differently. The moment he saw the frail, sweet, and beautiful girl, he couldn't believe it was the spy everyone was talking about. They introduced themselves to each other, and surprisingly, their conversation goes quite well. The guy ended up saying it was really nice to meet you and said it was time for him to leave. And also, he switched that he would always stand guard and protect her safety. So if she needed anything, he would always be there for her. After that, he went about his business and finally the girl was alone. As a result of this conversation, and given everything that's happened lately, it seems increasingly impossible to escape. So Asya realized if she kept sitting around doing nothing, nothing would change. The girl decided to go out for a walk to take in the surroundings near the buildings. But even at that moment, she was met by the king. It was as if he had been waiting for her to appear, and knew that now was the time she would want to do it. She was very much startled. She turned around and looked him in the eyes with a very scared look. The girl really didn't expect to hear his voice at this moment. Muckle keeps showing up at a place and time that is very bad timing, but he's entitled to it anyway. I really wonder what he wants to tell her, and if he'll think this time it's another escape attempt. Due to her excitement, Asya started to get very indignant and asked him to stop following her. And also, she said that she had already realized that she seemed suspicious to him. Michael replied that she was very guessable, and then purposely laughed, looking into her eyes. Then, the girl asked why he was here, to which the guy replied that he didn't have to answer to her, and after that he hinted that he just wanted to see her, only it sounded too unrealistic and not sincere. As soon as the girl heard those words, instead of smiling, she had an ambiguous reaction to it. On the one hand, she felt very unpleasant to hear him say that, and on the other, she seriously wondered why he had come here alone and waited for her to show up. So, they have a mutual distrust of each other and of course a lot of questions. The thing is, the king usually only sees two kinds of states in the people he interacts with. The first being abject fatigue and hopelessness. And the second, the most common, is the intense fear in the presence of their king. Around him, some are afraid to even breathe, let alone speak their mind. Therefore, Ash's behavior is very unfamiliar to him. He has never yet seen girls who are not afraid of him and can say absolutely everything they really think. From the very first day, he saw in her a special girl who immediately attracted his attention. It's like he sees his reflection in her, and every time she's around, he feels as comfortable as possible. Surprisingly, he really likes it when she's not afraid of him and looks at him with a confident gaze. He probably feels that way because she's the first one who's not afraid to say or do something. But of course, his attitude towards her was also influenced by the girl's beauty, which is just incredible. He's getting the feeling that without her around, it's getting harder and harder every day. No wonder the king sometimes can't hold back from touching her hair or hands. There came a moment when the girl just couldn't stand it and told him what she thought, and after that, she asked how long he's going to control her. And when she's finally able to go back, she's no longer going to hide the fact that she doesn't plan on staying here. And that is not up for debate, because she was not born in this empire and is not bound by the rules set by the king. She's a free person here, and she'd like to be able to leave at any time. But for some reason, the guy, as usual, misunderstood her. Michael, that he was the reason and that maybe she didn't like his cold boyfriend-to-girlfriend attitude toward her. Surprisingly, the king began to remember those moments when they were alone together and suggested that if he tried to make amends, Asya could stay here forever. As usual, there was an awkward silence, and the worst part is that unfortunately the two of them misunderstand each other. The king sees her as a future wife and starts looking for a problem in himself, and the girl, dreaming of escaping from here. They have completely different intentions and plans for their future lives, and unfortunately, they are absolutely not and never will be the same. At some point, the guy finally changed the subject and decided to find out again how she'd managed to escape from jail back then. He spent his whole life believing that some building was the best protected and impossible to escape from. That's why he was so surprised at the successful escape, especially considering the fact that it was done by a girl without any help or preparation. He thought about it all the time, and the only thought he has is that Asya isn't at all what she's trying to be. In which case, she had no choice but to tell it like it really was, namely that she had used an ordinary hairpin. In response, the king warned that there could be serious consequences for cheating. He would never believe that it was possible to escape from his prison in this way. After a few minutes of conversation, Asya asked what else she needed to do for him to finally leave her alone. Michael said there was only one option, and after that maybe he could believe her. The king needs proof. He asked her to bring something that would prove what she said, but for some reason, he didn't say what it should be. After that, she went back to her room and started talking to her assistant, and at some point, made a sudden decision. The girl would sooner run away than prove something to him. She has no intention of humiliating herself in this way, and being constantly under his care. There is no freedom here for which she left home. Every day, she mourned more people about that time in the desert. She had approached that man. If the girl only knew what a mistake it had been. She would rather continue to suffer through the heat and find the right path on her own than seek his help. With each passing day, being here was becoming unbearable. Even though she had a good relationship with the aides, it still wasn't what she had dreamed of. She's constantly being suspected of something and trying to follow her even at times when it's very strange of them to do so. Sometimes Asya remembers those beautiful moments when she was happy at home, even though it was a very boring life. But unlike this one, then she was not afraid of anything and nobody told her anything. Maybe the decision to travel was really the biggest mistake of her life. Walking around the grounds of the mansion and imagining how things could have been different makes me want to make a plan to get out of here as soon as possible. Realizing that her time here could drag on for weeks, maybe even months, she begins to hate everything that's going on in her life right now. Every time she tries to come up with a plan, or at least think about it, unforeseen things or conversations come up that prevent her from doing so. The girl does not know when she will have free time to think more carefully about her plan of action and understand what is best to do in this situation. When someone starts talking to her, she automatically loses her mood and wants to say what she thinks. The situation has become so serious that if you think about it, the girl can't even return to her home. She is locked up in a neighboring empire and doesn't know if she has at least some guarantee of safety. Not to mention getting permission to leave here and doing it without any conflict. Meanwhile, the king, as usual, meets another guest who has an incredibly important and, as usual, complicated conversation with him. But even so, Michael tries to smile at him and remain as polite as possible. It's very important, and he's seen it more than once in his lifetime. They started talking about some banquet they were planning to have in the next few days, but it seems their opinions are a little different. One of them believes that the holiday should be held as soon as possible, while the other is sure that there is not such a strong need for it, because now is not the best time for it. Usually this event is organized on the same day for many years, but now the king has too many problems and important things to do, because of which he does not have time to organize a holiday as well. Maybe his reaction will be too harsh and it may seem like he's not interested at all, but in fact, if it weren't for all these problems, he'd love to organize a big event. But unfortunately, he had no desire or strength left, for the only thing he was interested in now was to find out at last once what Asya was hiding from him. He still doesn't even know or recognize what he wanted from the beginning, from the day he first met her in the desert. It confirms the fact that lately, even his aides have begun to notice that the king is very tired and doesn't look the same as before. He has a lot on his mind about a mysterious stranger about whom he wants very badly to know at least something. But since it's not working out, it's no wonder he's not in the holiday spirit. Plus, he won't even be able to relax and have fun at them like he normally would, which is one of the reasons why Michael doesn't want to rush into it and suggests moving the event to some other day. When suddenly, very unexpectedly, the king agreed and said he could supervise the preparations. Michael just realizing how important this day was and that it was better not to miss it. This man who came to talk about it, he said he was very grateful to him because originally he didn't even think the king would agree to it. He thought it was impossible. But as it turned out, the guy is very kind and thinks not only about himself, but also about others. And after that, the most interesting thing started. This man suggested that instead of Asya, he should choose as his wife a girl who is this man's daughter. The guy clearly didn't expect this, and doesn't even know how to react to it. The man began to remind him that in the past, the king might have seen his daughter and perhaps he even remembered her. The girl had a memorable appearance, thanks to her red hair. He explained that he wasn't trying to push it, but he wanted the king to keep her in mind in case they had any problems with Asya's relationship. This man doesn't even realize how the king usually reacts to such offers. If he had witnessed in the past situation, he would never have suggested it in any way. Even now, it is not difficult to see how much the king is displeased with this conversation after he has made concessions about the feast. After hearing of some girl being offered to him as a wife, it has become unbearable. Michael does not know how to hint to him that he is no longer interested in such proposals. He has chosen for himself the only girl, and does not plan to look for someone else instead of her. It sounds a little strange, for Asya herself knows nothing of it. He has never once spoken to him on the subject, nor has he informed her that he plans to make her his wife. At some point, the guy couldn't take it anymore and said he'd had enough of this kind of talk for today. He didn't want to continue with this topic. He told him so directly. I'm surprised Michael reacted so much more aggressively last time, if this girl's appearance had affected his character that much. He didn't say a single bad word to this man, which is very unlike him. The king has always been very cruel, and only recently has become much calmer. The next day has come, and it seems that today, as usual, we can expect something interesting, because not a single day has passed as well as the previous one. First thing in the morning, Asya woke up and decided to go for a walk outside. She very rarely stays in her room and prefers not to sit still. As she looks over the huge fence into the desert, she has some hope that soon she'll be able to break free. The most frustrating thing is that every time she starts to miss her parents more and more, the girl imagines how far away they are now, and how long it will take her to see them again. At some point, she happened to meet a man she knew. The girl couldn't help herself and went straight to him. She was very interested in talking to him because there was no one else around. She realizes that the guy is at work right now and doesn't have time to talk, but despite that, she approaches him anyway. Despite the fact that this man is one of the people who suspect her the most, Asya wasn't afraid, and started this conversation first. It's not hard to guess that most likely she just liked him. And since the opportunity arose, the girl gladly took it, as suddenly. But I didn't think how it would look, and decided to inquire if he had a sweetheart. Thus, she declassified herself, and almost confessed that she wished to be one. Unconsciously, the girl began to compliment him, and after that, the guy didn't know how to behave in this situation or what it all meant. He was a little shy, and it was clear he had no experience with girls. All these questions were so unexpected that at that moment, William was very much at a loss for words. When suddenly, the two of them heard someone's footsteps, their sound beginning to intensify with each passing second. And of course, a girl being with another guy could only outrage one person, King Michael. Surprisingly, he asked politely enough when the two of them had managed to become friends and if the guy had so much free time at work. Afterward, his assistant came running to the king. He barely caught up with him and began to ask him where he was in such a hurry. Seems to start a little conflict, and it's nothing but jealousy on the part of the king. He clearly didn't like the conversation, the lover with the other guy, as suddenly, he didn't hesitate to ask a direct question. Did Asya have time to fall in love with one of his knights? The girl did not wait long and dared to answer that of course all girls adore knights, and this one turned out to be also handsome. Watching from the sidelines, the king's aide already realizes that conflict and something terrible is just inevitable. And after that, Asya wondered what was wrong with liking some guy, because at the moment, she was a completely free girl. I wonder how the king will react to these words, because this is the moment to finally tell her about his plans and his decision to marry her. At this point, to calm everyone down, his assistant decided to fix the situation. He reminded Asya that he had a few more days of questions to ask. He offered to go somewhere and continue the unfinished business, in the hope that in this way, he might be able to settle the misunderstanding at least a little bit. But it was not as easy as he had imagined it to be. The girl replied that from now on, she would not gratuitously answer these questions. Surprisingly, she wasn't afraid to say so. And very oddly, the assistant agreed to her terms and asked what she would like in return. Without a moment's hesitation, since the opportunity arose, she answered immediately and asked for her bag back immediately. With this request, she surprised everyone around her, and for the first few minutes, they didn't even know what to say to it. As suddenly, Michael joined the conversation and so put it that she only wants her stuff back so badly because there was a protection spell on some of it. So as not to tell the truth and admit whether or not that's really the case, Asya decided to come up with something. She confessed, allegedly there was nothing special about the bag, just spare clothes and a few books. And that's why she created a protection spell so no one could see what was in her bag, in case someone stole her bag. I really wonder if anyone will believe those words, although they actually sounded pretty convincing. At this point, the king for some reason could not help himself and started laughing. The girl was indignant and asked why he was laughing. As it turned out, he only laughed because it was actually a lot easier than they thought, and he ended up asking the assistant to return her bag. After a while, it was evening outside, and surprisingly, she was invited in for a little talk, and even treated her to dates, which is one of the symbols of this empire. They asked her to treat herself and apologize for perceiving her as a spy. Afterward, the king went about his business and did not distract them from another conversation. Asya was glad for the dates, but as soon as she heard that the topic of conversation was about her home empire, she was in a bad mood. She would have to pretend she didn't know anything, and this time she was asked to tell everything she knew about the empire. Not to think too long, she decided. In this situation, there was only one right way to best answer that question. Asya thought she would tell him what most people knew, without any details that would make it seem like she was there. The girl told him about the nature, the history, but at the same time, tried to do it as if she hadn't lived there all her life. She said that many people live there, and these people are the happiest people on the whole continent. In fact, from birth, she felt proud of her country and grew to love it even more during her many travels. It's the only place she feels safe, and realizes it's the best and probably most beautiful place in the whole world. Afterward, Asya went on to tell that there were only two powerful families in that empire of the Knight family that has been in charge of security and everything else that goes along with it for many years now, and the second family, a family of scientists. That's how the locals see them. Thanks to the protection of these two authoritative families, the imperial family has been able to become invincible, and no one can resist its power, which is why the political situation in the country remains stable. Many people know that there has never yet been an insurrection in the state. The empire is proud of it, as are all the locals. After a while, the assistant learned all the necessary information and thanked the girl for the story. As a result, he concluded that Asya knew quite a lot of information, though not long ago had convinced him that she did not. In reply, she replied that it wasn't, because everyone knew about it, and she was sure that any local resident could tell what she had. I really wonder what the guy concluded from this conversation, and whether he will continue to suspect her of being from there after all, and being born there. After that, he said that was enough for today, and hoped that next time, she would also tell him many more interesting things. The girl replied that it would only happen when they finally gave her her stuff, and if that didn't happen, she wouldn't tell them anything else. As it turned out, the guy was in no hurry to give her the bag, and warned that she would only get it when he had no more questions for her. At this moment, Asya felt most unpleasant, for just now, she had just been deceived, and had not done it all as promised. After a while, she went back to her room and regretted trusting these people, and agreeing to share this information with them. She began to reflect on what had happened, and realized that it seemed somehow she was back to square one. From that moment, Asya decided that she must act a little differently, for this could not go on any longer. She decided to take advantage of the guards' inattention and spring into action soon. How to get to the right place after escaping without anyone catching up with her. And at that moment, the girl remembers that problems must be solved as they come, and the first thing to think about is how to escape from here. As suddenly, she had a feeling right now that someone was watching her. She obviously felt it and realized that she was definitely not imagining it. Asya became nervous. She felt so awkward and scared that she just froze in one place and was afraid to look away. Surprisingly, instead of continuing to be afraid, she continued to do the intended thing and decided that she just wasn't going to pay attention to anyone else. She's too tired of being in this place, and if she keeps stopping and being afraid of something, she'll never make it back home. When suddenly, the conversation of some people suddenly stopped. They noticed some sound and started looking around. At this late hour they had a little apprehension, and also, owing to the darkness, it became impossible to see anything at a great distance. Very interested in what happens next and what we can expect from Asya's next attempt to do the impossible? As soon as they started looking around, somehow, amazingly, the girl managed to hide and go unnoticed. Asya had no problem hiding behind the nearest wall, and thanks to the fact that it's already night outside, it's a big advantage for her. It's so much easier for her to hide that way. By the way, some of these people thought that maybe they could hear a little kitten just walking around the palace grounds. After that, she was in the pool in some strange way. But doesn't it bother her that she might draw unwanted attention to herself that way? Very interesting what the girl is up to this time and what her future plans are so far. It's very hard to figure it out. For now, Asya finally relaxed, very curious as to where she was now and who these people were. It was a fling, but unfortunately she had a feeling it wasn't going to end well. In the time it had taken her to become accustomed to the king's gaze, meeting a new and equally powerful man. For the first time in a long time, his look has an unfamiliar feel to it. And it seems like he won't be as kind and polite as Michael was. After she saw this man for the first time, she realized she never wanted to meet him again. Even after some time, she does not lose the idea that she should avoid this particular person, and that he is the one who will cause her serious trouble. Enjoying the calm, she didn't have it for long. She noticed something was going on with her earrings. Just a few minutes later, Asya realized that she had completely forgotten something, and since it was very important, there was no way she could ignore it. At that moment, she forgot about everything else and focused only on one thing. The girl looked at the water and saw in the reflection that her earrings had changed color, and for sure it definitely meant something. Asya knew they didn't have enough power inside them, but she didn't think they would change color so soon. Unfortunately, she can't fix it, and in this situation, she has only one choice. She took the jewelry off, and decided that she would have to partially remove the spell from them after all, at which point the girl's hair color changed. And it seems that this is where the fun begins. You never know how she'll explain her transformation, or if she'll even do it. Surprisingly, after a while, she still managed to extend the spell and stay with the same hair color after all. She hopes that the magic will last at least a little longer, but unfortunately her real eye color is partially starting to show. Anyway, it's good that for now, nothing happened to her hair, at which point her assistant approached her and said she'd completely forgotten to tell her something. A few hours ago, the king asked that the assistant prepare the girl for the meeting. He wished to discuss something with her, and just a second later, she hears a knock on the door and realizes that it's him, but she doesn't know if he let himself do it without warning. Asya made no effort to hide her opinion and began to resent why he began to come to her so often. The king ignored the question and started talking to her on the subject of hair. He tried to do his best just to get her to stop being mad at him. Michael said he'd noticed her very long hair before and wondered if it didn't bother her when she traveled, to which the girl replied that sometimes They are really very disturbing, and every time, before going on a trip, she wanted to shorten them many times. But the only reason she still hasn't is because of her parents, who have always been and will always be against it. The girl said that in their opinion, a lady should have long hair, because it is her pride. In the end, the girl decided that she would not get rid of them, because in fact, she is very afraid of regretting it as a result. Afterward, the king began to inquire of her about brothers or sisters, and asked her if she had any. To which the girl replied that she had no siblings, but she had cousins whom she took as relatives. Then there came another question about her name. Asya was surprised, and asked why he was asking about it. It turns out that, for some reason, he was very curious to find out if that was really her real name, because there was still a lot he hadn't found out about her until now. So, he intends to fix that. Meanwhile, the girl laughed and asked what was the point of her coming up with a new name for herself. She even revealed that her father had a name election for her that lasted for 3 whole months, so she would never have come up with a new name for herself. The king listened carefully to all this information, and he seems to have reached his conclusion and realized something. But for some reason, instead of saying something, he began to stare silently into her eyes and decided to touch her face again. And then, he did it after all. The king is sure. Someone like her was definitely raised in love and care. Judging by her behavior, it just couldn't be otherwise. And after that, he said a phrase which, hearing which, the girl knew at once for what he had told her of the love and care in which she had been brought up. The guy confessed that unfortunately, he never had all this. He has no idea what it's like to feel the care and love of his parents. He was very curious why a girl who grew up in a loving family would leave home and choose such a difficult path for herself. To which the girl replied and asked to be allowed to ask her a counter-question. Why then is he always at home? And as soon as she addressed him as a gentleman, he was very much surprised, for he had never had anything like that from her before. And at that moment, the girl thought she had said something wrong. She looked at him with a surprised look and asked what was wrong. A very awkward situation has arisen, and it's very interesting how the king will react to this, what he will do, and what he will say. She started asking him a lot of questions and hoped very much that his response would at least not be too aggressive. Though she still doesn't understand what she's done, it's obvious that it's better not to upset the king, because their trusting relationship depends on it. If he finally stops suspecting her, it means there's a lot more chances and opportunities to come home. As a result, she wasn't afraid and finally asked how it would be best for her to approach him, to which the guy replied that it was best when she addressed him by his first name. He said he didn't have to make something up, and it was best to leave it as it was. Asya promised that from now on she would never call him anything else, and would try to remember how important it was to him. In the end, she was able to fix the situation. The king even smiled, which means that everything is going well, and he is not upset right now. Finally, Michael said that if they had a misunderstanding or a similar situation, he would be happy to try to solve it the same way as now, without conflicts and everything else. At this moment, the girl didn't even know how to react to it. She saw his smile for the first time and realized that from the time she first saw him, this man had changed a great deal. After that, she remembered where it all started, and I decided to repeat my question that I had never heard an answer to, which was why everyone kept asking her so many questions, because she's already answered everything and has no idea what else she can tell them. As suddenly, Michael finally dared to answer the question. He told her that she actually, all because he liked her so much. Asya replied that she wasn't going to believe something that there was no evidence for. She refused to believe it and decided to just walk away. Michael grabbed her hand and told her not to go anywhere, but really, he would try to prove it was true. After that, the guy asked her another question, and this time, it had nothing to do with her past. The king asked why she thought he didn't know what he was talking about. She turned around and looked him in the eyes, and just couldn't believe what she had just heard from him. It just didn't seem possible to her. Michael kissed her. From this moment on, she had no reason to think his words weren't true, or that he was trying to deceive her. It's very interesting how this situation will end and how Asya will react to it because she didn't plan for it. At this moment, she felt his tenderness and started to believe his words. It was very strange that she didn't try to resist and let him do it, which means that it's safe to say she's definitely okay with it, because there's no way she's just afraid to say no or push him away at that moment. She was starting to have a lot of thoughts about this, And of course it wasn't without misgivings. She was sure this was part of his plan, and an attempt to keep her here forever. After a while, he finally stopped. Asya looked at him and began to wait for some sort of explanation. The girl realizes that after such a thing, they will have a very serious conversation, and each of them will have to say their opinion about it. Meanwhile, the guy also had a lot on his mind, and for a while, for the first time, he lost control of you. It's a very awkward situation during which the two of them are having a hard time controlling their emotions. Asya is frozen in one place and has no idea what they're going to talk about now. She had a very strong excitement, and an unusual feeling that made her want to go back to her room without anyone seeing her. She started looking for some faults in herself. She wanted to be alone and think about how wrong she had been in this situation. At this moment, the most unexpected and unpleasant thing happened, which she could not have imagined possible either. Michael started pointing out some mistakes to her, and wasn't afraid to tell her exactly what he didn't like. It sounded just awful. After that, she wished she hadn't pushed him away and gone to her room. It was very hurtful to hear such words, because she'd never done it before and she was afraid to hear it. But it didn't end there. It turns out saying she was inexperienced wasn't as scary as saying he'd noticed the change in her eye color a long time ago. Which means that if she doesn't explain something to him now, or at least try to, it's safe to assume that the trust between them is gone again. Asya had never felt so in danger as she did at this moment. The king had said it so unexpectedly that the girl had no idea what he should say to it, or if it even made any sense at all. She thought the change wasn't that significant, and no one would see the difference unless they were looking very closely. So she has no choice but to do. Well, she doesn't understand what this is about? The girl tried to be surprised and asked how this could happen. Afterward, to seem more convincing, Asya asked him to step aside and said she wanted to look at it in the mirror. The girl suggested that perhaps it was nothing more than a coincidence, and that it was just another test, because it was his job. The best thing she can do now is keep pretending and do whatever it takes to convince him that she doesn't know why. The girl was not even afraid, and asked if the king was sure that he did not have any problems with his eyesight, because after looking in the mirror, she supposedly did not notice anything, and found no difference from the way her eyes were before. Surprisingly, she did it very well. The girl will be rehearsed, and knew how to behave in this difficult situation. Then she turned back to Michael and waited for his answer, for she had done all she could and imagined she could do. The guy continued to look at her, but unfortunately, judging from his gaze, it was impossible to understand what he was thinking at that moment. After a while, his look began to change, and it seems that he is clearly dissatisfied with something. The king is ready to say something, but the girl realizes that nothing good should be expected. He said he couldn't help noticing the difference, for he always watches her eyes and remembers perfectly well what they were like a few days ago. When Michael realized one thing about this girl, for the first time, he stopped even thinking about the others. From day one, the guy realized she was special, and he was very curious to know what her secret was. Asya seems to be attracting his attention, and as of late, it's become impossible for him to be without her presence around him. It's getting harder and harder to do so every day. Every time he talks to her or tries to find out something, it's like she's not trying to trick him at all. But he knows and is sure that she's obviously not telling him something, so he won't rest until he finds out what it is. How suddenly he apologized to her and suggested that maybe he'd just made a mistake, or maybe he'd just imagined it. Michael had noticed that lately, even when he started to suspect her of something. He tried to ignore it simply because he didn't want to upset or scare her. After that, some more time passed, and as usual, another conversation and a huge number of questions began. This time, it's about her reason for wanting to start traveling and giving up the posh life she used to have. I wonder what the girl will say and whether she will tell them anything, given the fact that she still hasn't gotten her bag back. To make her more comfortable answering these questions, she's been made as comfortable as possible, and only then did she ask if it wasn't clear that she just liked it, because otherwise she would never have done it. In her opinion, this world is so delightful that it would be strange to stay in the same place for the rest of your life, and asked if he agreed with her or not. Michael replied that there was nothing surprising about it, and he understood her perfectly well, but he wanted to clarify something. He said that previously, he had never even considered leaving this place to start exploring new countries and beautiful places of this world. The girl said her opinion and reminded that sooner or later, everyone's life will come to an end, so everyone has a great opportunity to live it in such a way that they won't regret anything afterwards, and not think about how nice it would be to turn back the clock and do something that unfortunately we never had time to do. Afterward, Asya inquired if she could know one question for him, for since it was too late to, she wondered very much if he was going to go to his room. For after such a busy and hard day, she was very tired and would like to rest. To which the guy replied that for now he wasn't going anywhere, and then asked if there was a problem with that. Asya tried that while he was here, she was a little uncomfortable. After this, he asked her an even more unexpected question, whether he was preventing her from sleeping, to which the girl replied that she did not have to explain it to him, and he did not understand it, when suddenly, he didn't say a single word to her, and in the same second, suddenly decided to hug her. He did it so quickly that she didn't even have time to react. At this point, Asya didn't stay silent and asked him the quite expected question. She asked him what he was doing and what it all meant. Instead of any explanation, he simply asked her to rest. Unless, of course, she wanted to go back to where they left off last time. She didn't expect to hear that, and it was only after a few minutes that she realized what she was talking about. It turned out that last time, Michael kissed her and that was the end of it. Now it's clear what he said and what it means. To prevent it from continuing, she didn't resist and decided it would be much better if she just tried to sleep and ignore him. Since lately the king has been too persistent and won't take no for an answer, this was really the best solution. As a result, the next day came and unfortunately she didn't get a good night's sleep. She couldn't close her eyes and relax for a single second. The interesting thing is that the girl doesn't know how often he will stay with her and how to tell him the right way about something like this. She's not at all happy with it. In any case, she needs to change her plan a bit because as it turns out, unfortunately, it will now be simply impossible to do so at night. The only thing left for her to do is change her plan and act during the day. At least she can try to do that. Meanwhile, since the palace was now very crowded, Asya decided not to take any chances and wait for a while when there was no one around anymore. Being near her assistant and observing her surroundings, she had a strange sensation of as if everyone was much busier than usual today. There were many more people in the palace, and, as it turned out, they were all preparing for the upcoming banquet. After finding out some information from her assistant, the girl found out that in the near future, she would have the perfect opportunity to go undetected and finally try to escape again. She even thought that it was easier than she had imagined a few minutes ago, so she had to take advantage of this opportunity. But before she did, she would have to think carefully about her plan of action. Given the sheer number of people that will be in the palace very soon, no one will even notice her disappearance. And even if they start looking for her, it will take some time. At this point, she's already got a little plan to take all her stuff and run away on the second day of the banquet. Hopefully she'll do well and finally get out because that's really her biggest dream right now. For starters, she realizes that she needs to eliminate anyone who can or plans to spy on her. At that moment, she happened to run into this guy she'd recently complimented a lot, and he seemed to remember her very well. As soon as he saw Asya, he had an unsure look on his face. For last time, their meeting had been very exciting for him. As suddenly when the girl called his name and asked him to stop, he decided to ignore her. But Asya didn't stand for it. She walked up to him and made him do it. In fact, there is nothing surprising in his behavior. The knight is just afraid that this time it will be much more serious, and the king might get very angry, and since he doesn't want to let that happen, he does his best to ignore her so no one will see them chatting in the middle of the palace. It turns out the girl is doing this for a reason. She's planning to make sure he has no desire to follow or even think about her anymore. Since the guy had no other choice left, he said he suspected that maybe the girl had a crush on him, so he warned her that it was impossible. He's sure that if the king finds out about this conversation again, they'll be in very serious trouble. So he suggested that she not do that again. At this moment, some unfamiliar girl, whom Asya was seeing for the first time in all her time in this palace, came up to them. Instead of introducing herself or saying hello, she began to hint to each of them that if they didn't stop now, she would tell the king about it, and would enjoy watching them apologize to him. I wonder why she's doing this, and what this stranger is up to. She clearly has bad intentions, but it's unclear what she did to these two. They had never before communicated or known each other. Her behavior is very strange, and so far everything Totally unexplained. Most likely she's in love with the king and thus wants to try to make the guy change his mind and fall out of love with Asya. In order to prevent her from doing so and not to anger the king, Asya, as usual, made something up and explained that in fact, she had just learned of the knight's return and had simply decided to welcome him back. She said that the girl got it all wrong, and it was wrong of her to deceive Michael about something that wasn't true. It turns out that this girl is the daughter of the man who is against the king's relationship with Asya. Now I see why the girl has such an opinion of her. She finally decided to introduce herself. This girl's name is Julia. Despite her very beautiful appearance, her character is the complete opposite of beauty. Even Asya began to admire Julia, for there was no denying the fact that she was one of the prettiest girls she had seen here. She has a special appearance that is very different from other girls. Julia knows this very well, and of course she has a lot of fans who have been trying to get her attention for many years now. But for some reason, any guy who tries to show her attention or asks her out, she always refuses and never agrees to it. There is a suspicion that the girl does it on purpose because she has a plan to become the king's bride, which she will never give up. Even her father helps her in it. In any case, the girl has no idea what to do in this situation, and in case the king finds out about everything, it is unknown what to do and how to explain this conversation. She realizes perfectly well that from now on, Julia will be against her. And to help the girl, very unexpectedly, the knight decided to answer her. He made it clear that this conversation had nothing to do with her. So if she didn't stop trying to cause any problems for them, she was going to regret it very much. Because if he decides to tell the king about what happened, it is more likely that he will believe his knight and will not take seriously the words of the girl who has long dreamed of becoming his bride. And because everyone knows exactly what she's doing it for, Julia ignored the words and went on to insinuate that from the outside, their meeting looks like they're lovers, and it would be a good idea to tell that to someone who would hate it very much. And of course, at this point, there's nothing stopping her from doing that. The guy asked how dare she deceive the king only for him to break up and stop trusting Asya, because that's just awful and wrong of her to do that. It is very interesting what the girl will answer to it, because judging by her look, she absolutely does not care about these words. She is interested only in one thing, the breakup of Michael and Asya. To make things better, the girl joined the conversation and began to insinuate that Julia had no idea who she was trying to set up. She warned that if there was a situation or a conversation that made the king angry, the girl would regret it very much and would never think of coming up with anything else. Asya suggested that the best solution to this situation would be to part ways peacefully and never remember each other again. By appearances, it was the only safe solution for each of them. In response, Julia chuckled and made it clear that she didn't care at all how any of them reacted to her plan or any action. She was so confident in herself that so far she had not taken one word of theirs seriously, or even tried to think that it might not be right of her to interfere in the situation. Very interesting how this conversation will end and whether Julia is really as serious as it looks at first glance. Apparently from that moment on, the girls became real enemies for each other. It is impossible to imagine that once they became friends or someone apologized to each other. Given the fact that none of them intends to give up, this conflict will drag on for a very long time, and it is not known whether it will end at all. Anyway, it was Julia's own fault. She was the one who first book came up and started to resent it, hinting that the king would find out about it. It's very interesting to see what can be expected from this conflict and what each of them intends to do, except that the only problem is that in such a case, there's one more person who will immediately notice Asya's absence or escape. It complicates the girl's plan considerably, and it would not be surprising if, from now on, Julia were to watch her purposely all the time. Afterward, Julia went back to her friends and decided to tell them all that had happened during her absence. She said that from now on, her only mission for the near future would be to make life difficult for Asya and the knight she had just seen her with. After that, she didn't even say goodbye to them and left without explanation. No wonder if it had something to do with the recent conversation. Knowing her friend, the girls realized that very soon will begin something very interesting. Julia never gave up, and usually, even in the most desperate situations, continued to take revenge on their enemies. But the thing is, she has no idea how different Asya is from the girls who let her do this to them. It seems like it's not going to be as easy as she imagined it would be.